Hey guys, it's Amanda. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing, actually it's nighttime. It's like almost 11 p.m. when I'm filming this. It's not today. Hey guys, it's Amanda. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing a really interesting phenomenon, perhaps a micro phenomenon. I think the word I'm looking for is just trend. Anyway, it's the trend of a handful of influencers moving to New York City instead of Los Angeles. In the past year or so, I feel like I've seen more moving to New York City content than ever before, and a few influencers I've watched have even moved from LA to New York. People move to New York for so many different reasons, but one of the biggest incentives is career opportunities. Interestingly enough, this still applies for influencers, even though you can technically do this job from anywhere in the world, which is why I find this migration of sorts to be so interesting. I was hesitant to make this video for a second because obviously it's somewhat myopic to ask, why is every influencer moving to New York as an influencer who lives in New York? I kept on thinking that this might seem like a trend to me because I live in New York City. I moved to New York City in the past 3 years. I've made content about it and have naturally been recommended to watch influencers who do the same thing. So I did doubt that this was an actual trend people outside of the New York influencer milieu would care about. But Tiffany Berg also made a video about this recently, and it seems like this is a slightly larger internet trend. So today I'm going to discuss how and why New York has become the new LA amongst a handful of influencers. But before we get into that, I would like to thank Audible for sponsoring today's video. If you don't know, Audible is the leading provider of spoken word entertainment all in one place. They have the largest selection of audiobooks and a ton of binge-worthy podcasts. Lately, I've been listening to the Audible Original Life Skills podcast from Rookie Magazine, hosted by Tavi Gevinson, because I was obsessed with Rookie in high school, and I honestly forgot how not only aesthetically pleasing, but practical the advice on Rookie was. So I'm going back to the basics and learning things like how to be good at talking to people and how to stand up to your inner critic. Audible's latest membership offering is Audible Plus, which gives you full access to the Plus catalog, which has thousands of popular audiobooks, original entertainment, and podcasts ad-free. You can try 30 days of Audible Plus for free by going to audible.com/AmandaMariana or text Amanda Mariana to 500-500 to start using Audible today. That is audible.com/Amanda Mariana or text 500-500 to start using Audible today. Maybe I've influenced you to use Audible, but before you listen there, watch the rest of this video. So I feel like a good place to start is LA as the home of the influencer. In the early 2010s, YouTubers moved to LA in what seemed like droves. Creators from all sorts of niches moved out there, but this was especially true amongst the people I watched at the time, the teenish lifestyle/fashion/beauty community of YouTubers. It felt like all of them graduated from high school and then promptly moved to LA within the same 2-year period. LA was and is still such a popular destination for influencers because it's the city of dreams. It's where you go to get famous or more famous. At this time, I think a lot of people viewed YouTube and social media fame as a means to an end, that end being breaking into more traditional media and Hollywood. It kind of explains that era where every YouTuber had a book, a song, an acting gig. Some even got their own TV shows. A lot of people went on tour. Like, remember the concept of YouTubers going on tour? Does that still happen? Also, like, what did they do? I guess it was like a live Q&A type thing. Anyway, these more traditional mediums of entertainment were viewed as more legitimate and potentially more long-lasting and lucrative. I think over the past few years, though, this notion has shifted for a few reasons. One, people genuinely want to be YouTubers because they want to be YouTubers. Not everyone wants to host a TV show or write a book one day. 2, social media platforms and influencer marketing have grown so much in the past few years, and now it's actually very possible to make a living as a content creator, even if you don't have millions of followers. At this point, there's even a handful of people doing it with like a few thousand. I mean, look at the having 1,000 Instagram followers and a somewhat trendy feed to parade micro-influencer pipeline. The point is, now more than ever before, there are so many different ways to make a living as an influencer. While early on, it might have felt like if you weren't in LA, you were nowhere, people have branched out with the kind of content they create and consume. Now entering the traditional media landscape isn't the only way to succeed as a creator, and somewhere along the way, that picture-perfect LA content lost its appeal in favor of people who present their world as slightly more relatable than aspirational. This transition has led us towards a new genre of creators who capture the mundanity and realism of their lives through a subtly stylized lens. These are the kind of creators who seem to be the face of the great influencer migration to New York City. So who am I talking about? These creators, mostly young women, are relatable in personality. They feel like a friend, but what draws you to them is that they're very aesthetically aspirational in an understated way. They're conventionally attractive, usually thin and white. They wear cute, trendy clothes and live in the kind of apartment that feels like it belongs on a Pinterest board. And still, it never seems like she's trying. Her life just happens to look beautiful. The best way to describe her is the aesthetic blogger. My friend recently sent me a really great article called The Grand Unified Theory of Aesthetic Blogging by Safi Hallan-Farah, in which she dissects the project of aesthetic blogging and articulates why people seem to be so drawn to it. Farah writes, separated by age, geography, and cultural milieu, the most visible aesthetic bloggers, Elena Tabor, Jenny Wellborn, and Orion Carlotto, among others, present themselves as an aggregate of their commodities and interests, marrying sprezzatura, studied carelessness, with cuteness. The personality and history of their objects, whether thrifted, designer, upcycled, or coach gifted, like whimsical knickknacks or Detroit Floyd beds, and interests like yoga, reading, and film photography amount to simulacrum. I feel like this really encapsulates the intentional elusiveness of aesthetic vlogging. The whole point of it is that you shouldn't be able to pinpoint what exactly makes it so nice to look at. It's kind of like a visual ASMR. It feels really satisfying, but you don't quite know why. Farah notes, this is achieved through the minimalist white walls contrasted against the dark wood trims of their dwellings, exposed brick, textures, a downtown cool vibe, laminated glass tables, lacquered wood floors, books splayed and stacked across pine wood floors, elements of 1960s to 1980s Parisian and Italian modernist design, mid-century modern furniture and knickknacks, asymmetry, high ceilings, the organized nonchalance of Instagram photo dumps. I think this very accurately encapsulates the visual language of several New York-based aesthetic bloggers I follow. The point is, the collective of all these things makes up the mise-en-scène, which is precisely the aesthetic blogger's biggest selling point. This is why location is such an important part of their content. For the aesthetic blogger, location isn't just a backdrop, but a character. And right now, it seems like New York is the hottest one on the market. Writers from F. Scott Fitzgerald to Carrie Bradshaw made the pilgrimage to New York for work and inspiration. It's always been romanticized, but vloggers and influencers are doing it through a new medium. This brings me to a brief pit stop on the greatest city in the world propaganda, or how New York became so romanticized. Google couldn't really give me a definitive answer on this, but it seems that before the 1900s, the greatest cities in the world were pretty much synonymous with the most populated cities in the world, because what more could you ask for back then? Since the early 20th century, New York has become a muse and home to several great American writers, artists, singers, and filmmakers. I think mass media, especially in the form of TV shows and movies, have been particularly influential to New York's perception in recent decades. According to Wikipedia, in the early years of film, New York was characterized as urbane and sophisticated. By the city's crisis period in the 1970s and early 1980s, however, Films like Midnight Cowboy, The French Connection, Dog Day Afternoon, Taxi Driver, Marathon Man, Cruising, Dressed to Kill, and Death Wish showed New York as full of chaos and violence. With the city's renaissance in the 1980s and 1990s came new portrayals on television. Friends, Seinfeld, and Sex and the City showed life in the city to be glamorous and interesting. Shows and movies set in New York in the 2000s and onwards haven't strayed far from this narrative. We're told that New York is where the best meet-cutes occur, where the ingenue finds her voice, and if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. The piece of media that made me want to come to New York? Gossip Girl. The epitome of this city as seen through rose-colored, rather wealth-tinted glasses. So this is the part of the video where I just talk about myself because I'm kind of a real-life case study of an aspiring influencer who moved to New York City for the content. As I said, ever since I watched Gossip Girl when I was like 12, I wanted to move to New York City because the show made it seem glamorous and exciting. It represented a sort of independence I longed for. It seemed like in New York you could do anything you wanted whenever you wanted to do it. The funny thing is, I had been to New York multiple times before watching Gossip Girl because my grandmother lives in Brooklyn, so we'd visit her there and maybe spend a few hours in Manhattan. But even still, I never associated New York City with glamour until watching Gossip Girl. I just associated it with my grandma. I always enjoyed visiting, but it didn't occur to me that this might be a place to live. However, after watching Gossip Girl, I quickly became interested in having a life in New York that imitated what I saw on screen. When I turned 16, my parents surprised me with a weekend trip to New York, not my grandma's New York, but the Gossip Girl version of New York. We went ice skating in Bryant Park, visited the Met, and had a brunch at Serendipity. I was living my best life, and I was certain that this was what my future entailed. Because of my deep disinterest in frat parties and football games, I knew I wanted to go to college in New York City. Even though now I sometimes romanticize the idea of an idyllic small-town college experience, I knew what I really wanted was to feel independent and not tied down to a campus culture. I had this sort of callow belief that if I went to a school with a football team, there would simply be no one in the entire university whom I could befriend, which is obviously not true, but my mindset was basically, I need to go to the place that I want to be at the most, because then I'll meet the people who want to be there too, and those are the only people who could possibly ever relate to me. What I'm trying to say is that I was as insufferable as Lady Bird.
I want to go where culture is, like New York, or at least Connecticut or New Hampshire, where writers live in the woods.
Get into those schools anyway.
So that was part of the reason why I wanted to go to school in New York City, and the other big reason was the content. You heard me right, the content. I've had a YouTube channel since 6th grade. I made random videos and vlogs throughout middle school and high school, but none of them ever took off in any sort of significant way. It was just me speaking into the void, and it was a fun way to save memories of me and my friends. But when I was a senior in high school in 2018, I swear this was the year that college decision reaction videos started to become a thing. And when I realized that, I knew I had to capitalize on this moment, because you can only be a senior in high school once, and you can only record your live reaction to a college admissions decision once, and I just knew this is what would launch my channel. So I made the college decision reaction video, which I ironically dabbed in multiple times, and it was by far my most viewed video. After I posted it, one of the most frequent questions people commented was, how did you get into NYU? And that's when the light bulb went off, guys. I was like, this is content people want to see. For the first time in 5 years, I was getting a significant amount of views because of this NYU college-related content, and it was a big reason that I wanted to commit to this school. I just had a funny feeling that I wouldn't get the same degree of attention if I didn't go to a well-known college. Even though I did get a significant scholarship, NYU was still the most expensive school I could have chosen, but I didn't care because I needed it for the content, and I was convinced that it would pay off one day. Call me That's a Raven, because I could see into the future, and it kind of worked. NYU and New York became the bread and butter of my content. I was a micro-influencer. I made a couple $100, and by the end of my freshman year, I got to be in a Target ad. I was living the dream and basically doing the same thing into sophomore year. That is until COVID hit. I was back to square one. Suddenly, I was in my childhood bedroom where this all started, except this time there were no signs that I'd be leaving. I couldn't really do my NYU vlogs anymore because I wasn't at NYU, and New York City was the epicenter of a pandemic. This was a problem, not for global public health, but for my content, clearly. Because I was like, ugh, my house is not aesthetic, I can't really do vlogs here, and also they're boring just because like I'm sitting on Zoom all day. So I shifted my content towards what I'm doing now, me talking to a camera in a nondescript room. The point of this long-ass anecdote about my college and YouTube career is that I literally stopped being a vlogger because I felt that my location wasn't good enough anymore. I knew that if I wanted to get views, the videos I made at home had to become more scripted and planned out instead of just vlogs, because there was no longer something inherently interesting or clickable about where I lived. Of course, this is just my experience, and anecdotal evidence isn't empirical, but I think it shows how important location, specifically New York City, can be to one's content. This brings me to why I think influencers have been moving to New York. The most obvious question we must ask is, what is it about having New York City in the thumbnail or title of a vlog that makes it so much more appealing? The obvious answer, of course, is that New York has been romanticized for decades. Like, I don't care how cool the vlogger is, Day in My Life in Omaha, Nebraska just doesn't have the same buzz as Day in My Life in New York City. No shade to Nebraska, but I just don't see a reality in which a video with that title would get more views than a New York City-based version. But maybe this isn't the best example. There aren't a discernibly significant amount of vloggers based in Omaha, Nebraska, but there are a lot of them in LA. Some might even say too many, which is why, amongst creators and consumers of vlog content, New York City seems to be a breath of fresh air. I've never even been to LA, but I've seen the Pink Wall, the palm trees, Rodeo, and the Grove through the eyes of so many vloggers. New York, on the other hand, feels fresher and undiscovered, less, dare I say, basic. It's edgier. It's not like the other girls of influencer cities. So I have a theory, but before I get into it, of course, it's important to note that you can never fully generalize a city based on a handful of the most visible people in it. With that being said, I feel like the influencer version of LA is soft, pink, girly, vapid, and superficial. It looks really nice, but inside it feels empty, while the influencer version of New York is all hard lines and sharp edges. It's gritty, there's texture and friction in your daily life, even if you live in Soho. The most fake parts of New York somehow feel more real than LA. The apartments are smaller, the weather is worse, sometimes it smells bad, and your travel is dictated by the whims of the MTA. If you live in New York, every day is a hustle, even if your destination is a nail appointment or an influencer event. The way you physically move through the city is kind of like an obstacle course. You interact with so much more than just the inside of your car. There's much more chance for risk and spontaneity. In general, it just seems less mundane. This is why I think New York is becoming an increasingly desirable place for influencing and especially vlogging. You get to cosplay as a girl boss and defy the stereotypes of influencing not being real work. In a 2021 interview with Business Insider, vlogger Elena Tabor said she chose not to move to California's influencer hub, Los Angeles, because she thought New York would challenge her more. This is partly because everyone in New York seems to be working so hard, she said, while LA is more about chill lifestyle content. Of course, this isn't to say that people in LA don't work hard, but I think influencer work in LA has a different veneer to it. LA seems to revolve primarily around Hollywood and social media, while New York has a bunch of different industries packed into a smaller space. Being in an environment like this lends the largely self-directed job of influencer to get swept up in the grind of everyday New York. Even though there's nothing fundamentally different about the job, It feels different in New York compared to LA because the city isn't siloed by trade. When Rebecca Jennings of Fox documented her experience profiling a prominent New York City TikToker at an influencer event, she noted, "The TikTokers have a 40-person group text called NYC Babes where they share party invites and other relevant gossip and assure me that it's much different than LA. People actually have jobs here," one girl tells me, even though so far most of the people I've met do not. This brings me to the biggest qualm that actual New Yorkers seem to have with the influencerification of their city. The TikToks. The depictions of New York as a 60-second supercut filled with brunch, shopping, and champagne. Like I said earlier, the romanticization of New York is not new, but the medium of vlogging, influencing, and TikToking is. Medium is important, sometimes it is in fact the message. Although New York has been heavily romanticized through TV shows and movies, it is more explicitly understood that those representations are fake. While the set of New York itself is real, the actors are understood to be playing a role. When it comes to influencers documenting their lives on social media, however, the line between reality and fantasy is blurred. What influencers show is technically their lived experience, but their lived experience encompasses what they don't show too. We just don't see it. While a lot of people, including myself, believe we're savvy enough to realize this, the medium of social media itself, not just the influencer, can prevent us from seeing the full story. You only get 60 seconds for a TikTok and 1080 by 1080 pixels for an Instagram picture. This can lead to unfair judgments of an influencer's life based on the little information we have, and it can cause impressionable audience members to take an influencer's portrayal of life at face value. From the pushback I've seen, this is the greatest concern from native New Yorkers. Influencers aren't showing the authentic New York experience, and their idealized portrayal could potentially influence some of their followers or even fellow social media peers to move to New York, do the same things, and suddenly the city might become oversaturated with the fakeness once associated with LA. This concern isn't necessarily new. Again, from the same Vox article, Jennings writes, "What NYU girls were to the city back when I was one of them nearly a decade ago, NYC TikTokers are now, seen as gentrifiers and transplant, but worse than that, annoying."
I'm definitely a Carrie at heart, but like sometimes Samantha kind of comes out.
Fortunately, I don't think influencers can single-handedly alter the cultural and demographic makeup of New York City, and as far as gentrification goes, influencers seem to be more of a symptom and less a cause. From what I've seen, they tend to inhabit the already wealthy and trendy parts of New York. I guess the most disappointing aspect of living in New York as an internet trend is that even with platforms that have supposedly democratized content creation, what seems to rise to the surface and get the most attention is the same narratives we've already seen in movies and TV shows about New York. I don't think that influencing in or romanticizing New York is going away anytime soon, but I hope that diverse perspectives can help us paint a more accurate picture of this city. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, excited to hear your thoughts, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!